You know how some days just feel perfect? Not because anything spectacular happens, but because everything just feels right. The light is softer, the air is sweeter, and for one beautiful moment, the world isn't a scary place. For David Campbell, a Saturday in late September was one of those days. The last one he would ever have. It started with the smell of sizzling bacon and the sound of an old classic rock station playing from a radio on the kitchen counter. Flour dusted the air like snow. David was on pancake duty, while his 16-year-old daughter, Lily, was meticulously arranging a bowl of blueberries. She stole one, popping it into her mouth with a grin. This was their ritual. Saturday morning breakfast, just the two of them. It was their little island of peace in a busy world. Lily was the kind of kid who filled a room with her energy. Not loud, but bright. She had a smile that could make you believe in good things. And she was brilliant with a paintbrush. While David flipped a pancake, she nudged him and nodded toward the kitchen table. There, propped up against a juice glass, was a small canvas. It was a portrait of him. But not just any portrait. She'd captured him in his favorite armchair, reading a book, with that little crinkle of concentration he gets between his eyebrows. The detail was breathtaking, the way the lamplight hit his reading glasses, the faint threadbare patch on the elbow of his sweater. It was so real, so full of love, that for a second he couldn't speak. "Lily, this is—" he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. She just beamed, her pride silent and absolute. They talked while they ate. Really talked. She told him about her dream to go to the Rhode Island School of Design, about a new technique she wanted to try with oil paints. He told her stories about trying to paint his own bedroom as a teenager and ending up with more paint on the ceiling than the walls. They laughed until their sides hurt. He looked at her, this amazing young woman with flour on her nose and a future so bright it was blinding, and he felt a surge of pure, uncomplicated joy. This was what it was all about. This was everything. Later that afternoon, the sun started to dip, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn. Lily had plans to meet a friend at the library to work on a project. "Don't worry, Dad," she said, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. "I'll be back before dark." She gave him a quick, one-armed hug. "Love you." David stood at the screen door, watching her wheel her bike out of the garage. She waved once before pedaling down the street, her red jacket a bright spot against the green of the trees. He watched until she turned the corner and disappeared from sight. He stood there for a moment longer, the screen door cool against his hand, the memory of her laugh still hanging in the air. He had no way of knowing he had just experienced a miracle. He had just lived through the last perfect day. That perfect, golden afternoon faded into a quiet evening. David did the dishes, the radio still playing softly in the background. He picked up Lily's portrait again, smiling to himself. He thought about how proud he was of her. How lucky he was. He had no idea that in that very moment, his entire world was already ending, mile by mile, as a phone began to ring in a police station downtown. The sound that broke the silence in his own house was sharp and electronic. The landline. The one they only kept for emergencies. It was after 10 p.m. David's heart gave a little jolt. Who could that be? Maybe Lily forgot something? He wiped his hands on a dish towel and picked up. The voice on the other end was professional, calm, and utterly terrifying. "Is this David Campbell?" "Yes." "This is Sergeant Evans with the Oak Ridge Police Department. There's been a traffic accident involving your daughter, Lily." The world didn't slow down. It stopped. The dish towel dropped from David's numb fingers. The officer's words became a blur after that. Canyon Road, bicyclist, paramedics on scene. David didn't hear the rest. He was already fumbling for his car keys, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He muttered a, "I'm on my way," into the phone and slammed it down. The drive to the hospital was a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Streetlights streaked past the windshield like dying stars. Every red light felt like a personal attack. His mind raced, offering up desperate, crazy bargains with a God he hadn't spoken to in years. Please, let her be okay. Let it be a broken arm, a concussion, anything. I'll do anything. Just let her be okay. He screeched into the hospital parking lot, abandoning his car in a space meant for ambulances. He burst through the emergency room doors, his eyes wild. The bright, sterile light was a shock. A nurse looked up, and the moment her eyes met his, he knew. He saw it. That flicker of pity, that practiced, solemn calm. Before she could even speak a word, David Campbell's legs went out from under him. He didn't hear the official words, "I'm so sorry, we did everything we could." He didn't need to. He already knew. The love of his life, his bright, beautiful Lily, was gone. While David Campbell's world was shattering into a million pieces in a cold hospital hallway, on the other side of town, in a house that was all sharp angles, glass, and cold modernity, a very different scene was unfolding. There was no grief here. No stunned silence. Instead, there was a quiet, simmering fury. 17-year-old Jake Thompson sat on a white leather sofa that cost more than most people's cars. He wasn't thinking about the girl on the bicycle. He was thinking about the crumpled front end of his Audi, a birthday present from just 3 months ago. His hands were still shaking, but not from remorse. From adrenaline. And from fear of the man pacing in front of him. That man was his father, Robert Thompson. Robert wasn't a large man, but he carried himself with a force of will that made rooms feel smaller. He'd built a fortune in commercial real estate by being harder, sharper, and more ruthless than anyone else. And right now, he was looking at his son not as a child who might be traumatized, but as a liability that needed to be contained. "This," Robert said, his voice low and dangerous, "is a problem, Jacob. A significant problem." He wasn't talking about the loss of a life. He was talking about the police report, the potential headlines, the stain on their name. Jake looked up, his face pale. "She came out of nowhere, Dad. I swear. The rain. I couldn't see." "Stop talking," Robert cut him off, his voice like a whip. "Do not say another word to anyone until I have a lawyer here. Do you understand? Not to the police, not to your friends. No one." He poured himself a finger of expensive whiskey, the ice clinking in the silence. "We need to get ahead of this. The narrative is everything." And that's when Jake's fear began to morph into something else. Something uglier. His father wasn't yelling at him for killing someone. He was strategizing with him. It made Jake feel important, involved. The initial hollow shock he'd felt at the scene was being filled with his father's cold certainty. This wasn't his fault. It was a situation. A mess to be cleaned up. Robert picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found a number simply labeled Vance, Legal. He put the phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving his son. "Alexandra? Robert Thompson. We have a situation. I need you here immediately." He listened for a moment, then said the words that would define everything that came next. "A car accident. There was a casualty. A teenage girl. My son was driving." He didn't say, "He might have been at fault." He didn't say, "We're so sorry." He presented it as a simple, unfortunate fact. A business problem. As he hung up, he looked at Jake, who was now sitting up straighter, absorbing his father's confidence. "Listen to me, Jacob," Robert said, his tone softening into something that almost sounded like reassurance, but was really just instruction. "This was a tragic accident. The weather was bad. The road was dark. You are a good kid who had a terrible thing happen to him. That is the story. That is the only story. Do you understand?" Jake nodded, the last of his guilt being smothered by a newfound sense of purpose. He wasn't a killer. He was a victim of circumstance. And his father, with all his money and power, was going to prove it to the world. The human heart isn't designed to grieve in public. Grief needs quiet rooms and soft voices. It doesn't belong under the harsh, fluorescent lights of a courtroom, surrounded by the rustle of papers and the bored glances of strangers. But that's exactly where David Campbell found himself just a few weeks later, sitting on a hard wooden bench that felt like an instrument of torture. This was the arraignment. A word David had only ever heard on TV. It sounded official, simple. He thought it was where the person who killed his daughter would say he was sorry. He was about to learn how naive he was. The door beside the judge's bench opened, and Jake Thompson walked in. David's breath hitched. Jake was wearing a suit. A nice, conservative, dark blue suit, a white shirt, and a simple tie. He looked like he was on his way to a college interview. His hair was neatly combed. He stood beside his lawyer, Alexandra Vance, a woman whose sharp, expensive suit and perfectly still posture screamed of money and victory. She looked utterly unbothered. When the judge asked for his plea, Jake's voice was clear and steady. Not guilty. The word landed in the silent room like a physical blow to David's chest. Not guilty. After everything. After the skid marks, the witness statements, the fact that his daughter was dead. Not guilty. It was more than a legal term. It was a moral betrayal. It felt like he was watching someone erase Lily, right in front of him. But the real slap in the face came next. As Alexandra Vance stood to argue for Jake's release before the trial, her language was carefully chosen to be a weapon. She didn't talk about a life taken. She talked about a tragic accident on a poorly lit, rain-slicked road. She called Jake an honor roll student with a bright future, a phrase that made David's stomach clench. His honor roll student was in a cemetery. And then, Vance went for the gut punch. "Your Honor," she said, her voice dripping with false regret, "we may never know what the victim was doing in that lane. We know she was wearing dark clothing. We know she was not wearing a helmet. This is a tragedy, but it is not a crime. The victim." She reduced Lily to the victim. And in the same breath, she implied it was Lily's own fault. David felt the air leave his lungs. He gripped the bench in front of him, his knuckles turning white, just to keep from screaming. This wasn't justice. This was a game. A twisted, cruel game where his daughter's life was a debating point. As the judge set a trial date and released Jake on his own recognizance, David saw it. Jake, turning slightly as he walked back to his seat, caught the eye of a friend in the back of the gallery. And for just a split second, the solemn mask slipped, and a tiny, relieved smirk flickered across his face. It was there and gone, but David saw it. He saw everything. Outside on the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed. Microphones were thrust in his face. Cameras clicked. And one reporter, a young woman with a piercing look, asked the question that would haunt him for months to come. "Mr. Campbell, in all of this, are you seeking vengeance, or are you seeking justice?" David just stared, his mouth agape. The question felt like a trap. In his heart, in that moment, they felt like the exact same thing. But before he could find the words, the moment was over. The crowd shifted, chasing after Robert Thompson and his legal team, who were already spinning their version of the truth. David was left alone on the steps, the cold wind biting through his jacket, realizing with a sickening clarity that the fight for his daughter's memory had just begun, and he was already losing. After the noise and the cruel theater of the courtroom, going home was its own special kind of agony. The house on Maple Lane didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a tomb, a museum dedicated to a life that had been violently interrupted. And David was the sole, grieving curator. He'd shut Lily's bedroom door the night she died. He hadn't opened it since. It was just a door, a simple panel of painted wood, but to David, it was a barrier between the unbearable present and a past too painful to face. Sometimes he'd stand outside it, his hand hovering over the knob, his heart hammering in his chest. He could almost hear the faint sound of her music from the other side. But when he listened, really listened, there was nothing. Just a silence so deep and profound it felt like its own presence. A ghost made of quiet. After a few weeks, he tried to go back to work. He was a history teacher, and he thought the routine, the familiar faces of his students, might be an anchor. But it was a disaster. Standing in front of a classroom of 16 and 17-year-olds, all he could see was Lily. Their laughter, their whispered jokes, their vibrant, alive faces. It was all a constant, piercing reminder of what had been stolen. He was trying to teach them about the past while his own future had been erased. He called in sick the next day, and the day after that, the silence of his empty house feeling less painful than the sound of living children. The moment that truly broke him, and in breaking him, began to change him, came from an unexpected place. He was checking the mail, sifting through bills and ads, when he saw a small folded piece of paper. It was from Sarah, one of Lily's best friends. She'd slipped it into the mailbox. In messy, teenage handwriting, it read, "Mr. Campbell, Lily drew this for you a while ago. She was going to give it to you for your birthday. I thought you should have it." With trembling hands, David unfolded it. It was a simple pencil sketch, but it was them. Him and Lily, sitting right here at the kitchen table, laughing. She'd captured the exact way he threw his head back when he really laughed, the way her eyes crinkled shut. It was another perfect, loving moment, frozen in time. And it was a gift she would never be able to give him. He didn't cry. He was past the point of tears. He just sank to the floor in the hallway, the drawing held tight against his chest. The pain was no longer a sharp, stabbing thing. It was a deep, cold, hardening weight in the center of his being. The grief was turning into something else. Something solid and determined and fierce. That night, the silence in the house felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. And David was no longer just a grieving father living with a ghost. He was a man starting to listen to the new, steely voice that his grief had become. The system had failed him. The world had failed him. But he was still Lily's father. And he was just beginning to understand what that really meant. There's a certain rhythm to the legal process. A slow, grinding pace that's designed to drain you. To make you tired. To make you just want it to be over. And David was learning that lesson the hard way. Just when he thought things couldn't get more bleak, the system had a new way to disappoint him. It was called a plea deal. He was sitting in the prosecutor's office, a beige room that smelled of stale coffee and hopelessness. Ms. Flores, the deputy DA assigned to his case, looked tired. She slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward him. "This is their offer, David," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I recommend we take it." David picked it up. The words swam in front of his eyes. Involuntary manslaughter. A charge that sounded like a mistake, an oopsie. And the proposed sentence, 3 years in a youth correctional facility. With good behavior, Jake Thompson could be eligible for parole in 18 months. 18 months. He looked up at Ms. Flores, his face a mask of confusion. I don't understand. The evidence, the reckless driving." "It's not a sure thing, David," she explained, leaning forward. "Juries are unpredictable. They see a young, clean-cut kid from a good family, and they hesitate. They think, there but for the grace of God go I. This." She tapped the paper. "This is a guarantee. He will be convicted. He will serve time. It may not be as much as we want, but it's something." "Something," David whispered, the word tasting like ash. "You call this something? This is my daughter's life. This is a sale price." He felt the hardened grief in his chest tighten into a cold, hard knot. They were asking him to trade Lily's memory for a guarantee. To accept a discount on justice. But the real insult was yet to come. Later that week, as David was leaving the courthouse, Robert Thompson approached him. He didn't have his lawyer with him. It was just the two of them, two fathers standing in the echoing marble hallway. Robert's voice was low, conspiratorial, devoid of any actual emotion. "David," he began, as if they were old acquaintances, "this has been hard on everyone. These legal battles, they're a circus. They drain you. Financially, emotionally." He paused, letting the word financially hang in the air. "I want to propose something. A settlement. A significant financial compensation for your loss. We can end all of this today. No more trials. No more media. You can finally have peace." David just stared, utterly stunned. He wasn't being offered an apology. He was being offered a payoff. Robert Thompson was literally trying to write a check to make his son's murder charge disappear. It was so cold, so transactional, it took David's breath away. This wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about cost versus benefit. And David realized, in that horrifying moment, that to Robert Thompson, his daughter's life had a price tag. And he was willing to pay it. He was about to refuse, to tell Robert exactly where he could put his money, when he heard it. From a side hallway, just around the corner, came the sound of Jake's voice, clear and whining, talking to his father's lawyer, Alexandra Vance. 18 months? That's a lifetime. I can't do 18 months in some juvie hellhole, Jake complained. And then David heard Vance's cool, reassuring reply. Relax, Jake. It's the worst-case scenario. My job is to make sure it doesn't happen. And between you and me, this judge hates long trials. I think I can get her to reduce it even further. You just have to trust me. There was a beat of silence, and then Jake's response, delivered with a faint, ugly laugh. Man, you're a witch. A really expensive witch. David stood frozen, Robert Thompson forgotten. He wasn't just fighting a careless kid. He was fighting an entire machine. A machine of money, of power, of lawyers who called themselves witches, and a boy who laughed in the face of the justice he was about to skate away from. The last shred of his hope for the system died right there in that hallway. He turned back to Robert, his eyes now as cold as the marble floor. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. In a voice so quiet it was more of a breath, he said, "There is not enough money in the world." Then he turned and walked away, the sound of Jake Thompson's laughter still ringing in his ears. It was no longer a sound that caused him pain. It was fuel. It was the sound that was going to make him do something he never thought himself capable of. A trial is a story. And whoever tells the better story wins. David learned this, sitting day after day in that courtroom, watching Alexandra Vance weave her masterpiece. She was an artist, but her canvas was the truth, and she was painting over it with a brush dipped in doubt and privilege. The prosecution's case was simple, solid. They presented the facts. The weather report showing the rain had let up over an hour before the crash. The skid marks that showed Jake was speeding, going way too fast for that winding road. A neighbor who testified to seeing the Audi fly past his house, like a bat out of hell, he'd said. It felt airtight. It felt like justice. Then, it was Alexandra Vance's turn. She stood up, calm and poised, and she began to take the facts apart, piece by piece. She didn't attack the evidence head-on. She just gently, insistently, clouded it. She cross-examined the neighbor. Mr. Jenkins, it was dark, wasn't it? And you were watching television? Could you say, with absolute certainty, that it was my client's specific Audi you saw? Or was it just a dark-colored car? The man's certainty wavered. The bat out of hell became a car going pretty fast. She brought in her own expert witness, a paid consultant, who talked about visual illusions on wet pavement and the limited visibility of bicycle reflectors. He used phrases like unavoidable accident and perfect storm of conditions. He made it sound like Jake was a pilot navigating a hurricane, not a teenager showing off in his new car. But the worst, the absolute lowest blow, came when Vance subtly put Lily on trial. She never accused her directly. That would look too cruel. Instead, she asked carefully crafted questions that hung in the air, poisoning the jury's mind. "We know Lily was a talented artist, don't we?" she'd say, sounding almost complimentary. "Often lost in her own creative world?" She'd pause, letting the implications sink in. A distracted girl. A girl who might not have been paying attention. She mentioned the dark jacket Lily was wearing that night. Not an accusation. Just a fact. A deadly, weaponized fact. David sat there, his hands clenched into fists so tight his nails left half-moon cuts in his palms. He was watching his daughter be murdered a second time, her character assassinated right in front of him. And through it all, Jake Thompson sat at the defense table, the picture of contrite youth. He'd nod solemnly, occasionally wiping at a non-existent tear. He was playing his part perfectly. Finally, the closing arguments were done. The jury was sent away to decide the fate of two families. The waiting was a special kind of torture. David paced the empty hallways, his mind racing through every piece of evidence, every statement. He tried to hold on to hope, but the memory of Vance's slick performance, of Jake's practiced remorse, was like a cold stone in his stomach. During one of these agonizing walks, he passed a small, open alcove near the vending machines. And there they were. Jake and Alexandra Vance, thinking they were alone. Jake was leaning against the wall, a can of soda in his hand. "The jury's been out a while," Jake said, his voice low but casual, no trace of the scared boy from the courtroom. Vance was checking her reflection in her phone. "They always are. It makes them feel important. Don't worry. I counted. We have at least 7, maybe 8, who bought our story. That's all we need." Jake shook his head, a slow, arrogant smile spreading across his face. "You know, for a second, when that cop was testifying, I actually got nervous." Vance snapped her phone shut and looked at him, her expression not one of disapproval, but of pure professional pride. "That's why you pay me the big bucks, Jake. My job is to make nervousness unnecessary." They shared a look of mutual understanding between a killer and the person who was about to set him free. And in that moment, David Campbell knew. He knew with a terrifying, absolute certainty that he had lost. The system wasn't just broken, it was a game he was never meant to play. The truth didn't matter. Only the story did. And they had told a better one. He walked back into the courtroom, his body moving on autopilot. The hopeful, grieving father was gone. In his place was a hollowed-out man, standing on the edge of an abyss. The jury was filing back in. Their faces were unreadable. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor. This is it. The moment everything changes. The verdict is about to be read. What would you do if you were David? If you saw the person who destroyed your life about to walk away scot-free, where would you go from here? Comment your guess below. Then, let's see what happens." The air in the courtroom became thick and heavy, like water you had to fight to breathe. David watched the jury foreman, a man in a plain blue suit, as he stood holding a single piece of paper. It was just a piece of paper. But in that moment, it held the power to validate a father's grief or shatter the last of his faith in the world. The judge's voice cut through the silence. "On the count of vehicular manslaughter, how do you find the defendant?" The foreman didn't look at David. He didn't look at Jake. He looked straight at the judge. "We find the defendant not guilty." The word "not" hit David first, a sucker punch to the soul. By the time guilty followed, it was just a cruel, meaningless sound. The courtroom erupted. Robert Thompson let out a sharp, relieved breath. Alexandra Vance allowed herself a small, tight smile of victory. It was over. They had won. But the legal formalities weren't quite done. Because of some convoluted legal ruling, the judge still had to sentence Jake on a minor, separate charge, a misdemeanor for reckless driving that the jury had convicted him on. It was a technicality, a footnote, a slap on the wrist. As the judge began to speak, given the circumstances and the defendant's clean record, Jake Thompson turned slightly in his chair. He looked over at David Campbell, who was sitting perfectly still, the world having just ended for the second time in his life. "And Jake," he smirked. It was a small, quick, private little smile. A flash of pure, unadulterated triumph. It wasn't enough that he'd won. He wanted David to see that he'd won. Then, he did something even worse. He leaned over and whispered something to his lawyer, and as the judge sentenced him to 2 years of probation and a suspended license, Jake let out a soft, muffled laugh. It was a choked, disrespectful sound that echoed in the hushed room. He was laughing at the judge. He was laughing at the law. He was laughing at the memory of a girl he had killed and gotten away with killing. And in that moment, something in David Campbell finally, completely and irrevocably snapped. He didn't cry out. He didn't collapse. He simply stood up. While everyone else was focused on Jake's disgraceful celebration, David turned and walked, calmly and quietly, out of the main courtroom doors. He disappeared into the hallway. For a moment, it seemed like he had just given up, slinking away in defeat. Jake saw him leave, and his smirk widened. He had broken the father, too. The judge slammed his gavel. Order. This courtroom will come to order. But the noise barely died down, because at that exact moment, the heavy main door to the courtroom creaked open again. Every head turned. The chatter stopped. And there, framed in the doorway, was David Campbell. But he was not the broken man who had left just 30 seconds before. His posture was different, straighter, harder. His face, which had been a mask of grief, was now a chilling blank slate. And in his hand, he held a plain, legal-sized, manila envelope. The room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Jake's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Robert Thompson leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. Alexandra Vance looked up from her notes, her professional calm finally cracking with a hint of alarm. David didn't look at any of them. His eyes were fixed on the path ahead as he took one step, then another, into the silent, waiting courtroom. He had stopped believing in the law. Now, it was time for his own version of justice. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sound was the soft scuff of David Campbell's shoes on the polished courtroom floor. He didn't rush. There was no anger in his steps, no frantic energy. His calm was the most terrifying thing in that room. He walked past the defense table. He didn't even glance at Jake, who was now staring, his face a confused mask of arrogance and sudden, dawning fear. David ignored him completely. He walked right up to the prosecution's table, where Ms. Flores sat, her hands still over her mouth in shock from the verdict. He stopped in front of her. He didn't say a word. He simply placed the plain, manila envelope down on the wooden table in front of her. The sound of the paper hitting the surface was a soft, definitive thud in the silent room. He tapped it twice with his index finger, a silent message, "This is for you." Then, he turned. His movement was so fluid, so purposeful, that every eye in the courtroom followed him. The judge, who had been about to demand an explanation, found herself silent, watching this strange, solemn procession. David now walked toward the defense table. The air grew colder with every step he took. Robert Thompson instinctively straightened his tie, his face hardening into a defensive scowl. Alexandra Vance began to rise, ready to object to, what? A man walking? A man looking? But David didn't look at Alexandra Vance. And he didn't look at Jake, who had shrunk back in his chair, all his bravado evaporated. David's eyes were locked on Robert Thompson, the architect of this entire circus. The man who thought every problem had a price. David stopped a few feet from them. The silence was so profound you could hear the rustle of the court reporter shifting in her seat. He spoke. His voice wasn't a shout. It wasn't even loud. It was low, clear, and carved from ice. Every syllable carried across the room. "You," David said, his gaze boring into Robert Thompson. "You should have taught your son that some debts can't be paid with money." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. They weren't the rant of a grieving father. They were the pronouncement of a judge delivering a verdict of his own. Robert Thompson opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The power of his wealth, his influence, meant nothing in the face of that cold, moral certainty. And then, as if he had simply delivered a piece of mail and was now finished with his business, David Campbell turned. He walked back up the center aisle, the same way he had come. His footsteps echoed. He didn't look at the stunned jurors, the gaping reporters, the judge who was watching him with a mixture of confusion and respect. He reached the large double doors, pulled one open, and stepped through. The door swung shut behind him with a soft, final click. For a full 3 seconds, the courtroom remained in absolute, stunned silence. Then, all hell broke loose. Reporters scrambled for their phones. The judge started banging her gavel, her calls for order lost in the sudden din. But the most important sound was the sharp, tearing of paper. Ms. Flores, her hands trembling with a frantic energy, was ripping open the manila envelope. She pulled out a single sheet of paper and a small, unmarked digital thumb drive. Her eyes scanned the paper. Her face, pale and defeated just moments before, underwent a dramatic transformation. Her eyes widened. Her jaw tightened. She looked up, first at the thumb drive in her hand, then directly at the judge, her expression one of sheer, unadulterated shock. She didn't say a word to the crowd. She turned to her assistant, her voice a sharp, urgent whisper that cut through the chaos. "Get the bailiff. The defendant is not to leave this courtroom." Jake's head whipped around. What is it?" Robert Thompson was on his feet. "What is the meaning of this? This is highly improper." But Alexandra Vance wasn't arguing. She was just staring at the thumb drive in the prosecutor's hand, her face a pale mask of dawning horror. She was a strategist. She knew a game-changing move when she saw one. And David Campbell had just checkmated them all without raising his voice. The reckoning wasn't over. It had just begun. And it was all contained on that tiny, unassuming piece of plastic. The courtroom didn't just erupt. It became a zoo. Reporters were shouting questions into their phones. Spectators were on their feet, craning their necks to see what was in that envelope. The judge's gavel was pounding, a useless, frantic drumbeat against the wave of noise. But in the eye of this hurricane, at the prosecution's table, a terrifying calm had descended. Ms. Flores ignored it all. Her entire world had shrunk to the single sheet of paper in her hands and the cheap, black thumb drive lying beside it. The paper was a simple, handwritten note from David. It said, "Ms. Flores. * they missed this. The police never canvassed the houses east of the crash site. This is from 47 Hemlock Way, 1/2 mile before the impact. The timestamp is 8:02 p.m. The crash occurred at 8:05. David Campbell." Her heart hammered against her ribs. 1/2 mile before the crash. This wasn't a snapshot of the accident. This was a record of the events leading to it. This was premeditation. With trembling hands, she handed the thumb drive to her tech assistant, who immediately plugged it into a laptop. On a small, private screen, a video player window opened. Alexandra Vance, trying to maintain control, stood up. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. This evidence is not part of the record." "Be quiet, Ms. Vance," the judge snapped, her eyes locked on the laptop. She had seen the look on Ms. Flores' face. This was no stunt. The tech assistant clicked play. The footage was grainy, dark, but crystal clear in what it showed. It was a high-angle shot from a home security camera, pointed at a suburban street, Hemlock Way. The timestamp in the corner glowed 8:02 and 17 seconds p.m. The rain had stopped, the streets shimmering wet under the streetlights. For a few seconds, the street was empty. Then, headlights appeared, moving fast. A dark Audi, Jake's Audi, streaked into the frame. It wasn't just driving. It was weaving. It crossed the double yellow line to pass a slow-moving minivan, cutting back into its lane with only a hair's breadth to spare. It accelerated, its engine a muffled roar through the laptop speakers, and then it passed a second car, a sedan, on a blind curve, tires kicking up a plume of water. It was more than speeding. It was a display of aggressive, reckless, intentional danger. It was the behavior of someone who believed the rules didn't apply to them. This was 3 full minutes before he ever saw Lily on her bike. This footage destroyed the entire foundation of the defense's tragic accident story. It proved beyond any doubt that Jake Thompson was a loaded gun driving down that road, and it was only a matter of time before he went off. The video ended. The screen went black. The silence that fell over the courtroom was heavier than any that had come before. It was the silence of truth, absolute and undeniable. Jake made a small, pathetic sound in the back of his throat. All the color had drained from his face. He looked at his father, but for the first time, Robert Thompson had no answer. He just stared at the blank screen as if it were his own tombstone. Alexandra Vance slowly sank back into her chair. She didn't look at her clients. She simply closed her leather-bound notebook with a soft, final click. She was a chess player who had just seen the other player reveal a queen she never knew was on the board. The game was over. Ms. Flores finally found her voice. It was steady now, filled with a righteous fire that had been absent for weeks. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, based on this new, irrefutable evidence, which proves conscious and wanton disregard for public safety prior to the collision, I move to have the not guilty verdict set aside and for the defendant to be immediately remanded into custody on new charges of second-degree murder. The words second-degree murder landed like a bomb. The judge, her face grim, nodded. Bailiff, take the defendant into custody. The motion is granted. This court is now in recess to review this new evidence for a retrial. As the bailiff moved toward him, Jake Thompson finally broke. "No, Ed, you said it was over," he screamed, his voice cracking with a raw, childish terror. But it was too late. The unseen witness, the silent, unblinking eye of a forgotten camera, had spoken. And its testimony was more powerful than any high-priced lawyer, any manipulative father, any smug, laughing killer. David Campbell hadn't brought a weapon into that courtroom. He had brought the one thing that had been missing all along, the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was the most devastating weapon of all. So how did he do it? While the lawyers were playing their games and the Thompsons were counting their certainties, what was David Campbell doing? He wasn't just grieving. He was working. You see, everyone had forgotten one crucial thing about David. He wasn't a detective. He wasn't a lawyer. He was a history teacher. And a history teacher's entire job is to piece together the truth from fragments, from overlooked details, from the evidence that everyone else has walked right past. It started in the deepest pit of his despair. A week after the first failed police investigation was closed, David was lying on his couch, surrounded by the crushing silence of his house. The district attorney's office had called, gently preparing him for the challenges of the case. They'd said the evidence was circumstantial. That word echoed in his mind. Circumstantial. It meant they didn't have a witness. They didn't have a confession. They had skid marks and probabilities. And that's when he had the thought. A simple, clear, terrifying thought. If they won't find the witness, I will. He got up. He went to Lily's room, for the first time since her death, and he took down the large, detailed map of Oak Ridge she'd used for a school geography project. He spread it out on the kitchen table, the same table from their last perfect morning. With a red marker, he drew a circle around the crash site on Canyon Road. Then, he started to think like a historian, not a victim. He knew the police had only canvassed the houses immediately adjacent to the crash. They were looking for people who saw the impact. But David was looking for someone who saw the cause. He reasoned that Jake's reckless driving wouldn't have started at the exact moment he hit Lily. It would have been a pattern, a habit. So David expanded his circle. He marked every house, every side street, for a full mile leading up to the crash site. The next day, he put on his best shirt, the one he wore for parent-teacher conferences, and he started knocking on doors. But he wasn't a frantic father begging for help. He was a teacher doing research. He had a cover story, one that was close enough to the truth to be believable. He'd smile a tired, gentle smile and say, "Hi, I'm David Campbell. I'm a teacher at the high school, and my students are doing a traffic pattern survey for a civics project. I was wondering if you have any outdoor security cameras that might have captured street traffic from a few weeks ago." He was methodical. He was patient. He faced slammed doors, suspicious looks, and a lot of people who just didn't have cameras. But he didn't stop. He was no longer just David, the grieving father. He was an archaeologist, digging for one single artifact that could change history. And then, on the third day, he met Mr. Henderson. Mr. Henderson was a retired engineer who lived at 47 Hemlock Way, a quiet, curvy stretch of road a full half-mile from where Lily died. He was a meticulous man. "A traffic survey, you say?" Mr. Henderson had mused. "Well, I do have a camera. Old thing. Points right at the mailbox to catch package thieves. Motion activated. It saves the data to a little drive. I never really look at it unless something happens." David's heart didn't leap. He didn't get excited. He held his breath. "Would you mind if I took a look? For the data? My students would be so grateful." Mr. Henderson, happy to help education, handed him the thumb drive. David drove home, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the wheel. He plugged the drive into his laptop. He scrolled through the files, his stomach a tight knot, until he found the one with the date of the crash. The timestamp started in the evening. 7:45, 7:50, 8 p.m. And then he saw it. At 8:02 p.m. The dark Audi, weaving, speeding, a ghost from the past, captured in grainy digital detail. It was the prelude to the murder of his daughter. It was the truth. He didn't cheer. He didn't cry. He made 2 copies of the file. He put one in a manila envelope. And he made a decision, a cold, calculated, teacher's decision. He wouldn't reveal this card during the game. He would hold it. He would wait until the jury believed the lie, until Jake and his father thought they were safe, until the very moment of their triumph. Because a true lesson isn't just about giving someone the answer. It's about making sure they understand the consequences of being wrong. And David was going to make sure Jake Thompson learned his lesson, once and for all. The second trial was nothing like the first. The circus had left town. The bright, flashing cameras were gone. The packed galleries were empty. This time, the courtroom felt like what it was supposed to be, a place for sober, solemn justice. The air wasn't charged with dramatic tension. It was heavy with a dreadful certainty. This was because Alexandra Vance had no defense. None. The video from Hemlock Way was a wall she could not climb, a story she could not twist. She tried, of course. She was a fighter. She filed motions to have the evidence thrown out, claiming David had no right to collect it. The judge denied them. She argued the angle was misleading. The prosecution brought in an expert who demonstrated, with chilling clarity, that it was not. She was a master fencer, but her opponent had just brought a gun to the fight. So, the second trial was a short, brutal, and quiet affair. It was less a battle and more a sentencing. The prosecution simply played the video. They played it once, then twice in slow motion. They had the crash scene photos, yes, but now they had the context. They could show the jury the predator, minutes before he struck. They could draw a straight, undeniable line from the reckless weaving on Hemlock Way to the shattered bike on Canyon Road. Jake Thompson, who had once sat with a practiced look of sad contrition, now just looked small. The expensive suit he wore seemed to hang off him. His shoulders were slumped. He kept his head down, scribbling nonsense on a legal pad, unable to look at the screen, at the jury, at his own father. The arrogant young man was gone, replaced by a terrified boy finally staring at the consequences of his actions. The invincibility his father's money had bought him had evaporated. Robert Thompson sat in the front row, directly behind his son. But the powerful, intimidating presence was gone. He was just a man in a suit, his face ashen, his hands clenched in his lap. He watched the video play, and you could see the moment he understood. This wasn't a problem his money could fix. This was a fact. His son was a murderer, and the whole world could now see it. The empire he had built, the fear he commanded, it all meant nothing here. For the first time in his life, Robert Thompson was utterly powerless. The defense rested without calling a single witness. What could they possibly say? Alexandra Vance's closing argument was a whisper of what it had been before. She didn't try to win. She simply pleaded for mercy, for the jury to see her client as a young man who made a terrible, tragic mistake. But the jury had seen the video. They had seen the intent. Not the intent to kill Lily, but the intent to drive like a maniac, to treat a public road like his personal racetrack, to value his own thrill over every other life around him. That was the charge. And that, the video proved beyond any shadow of a doubt. The jury was sent out. They returned in less than an hour. Their faces were grim, their decision unanimous. The foreman didn't even need to read the paper. The look in his eyes said everything. On the charge of murder in the second degree, the court clerk said, her voice echoing in the silent room, "How do you find the defendant?" The foreman's voice was clear and strong. "We find the defendant, Jacob Thompson, guilty." There was no eruption, no chaos. Just a collective, quiet exhale from the room. It was over. The sound that followed was the only one that mattered. It was the sound of Jake Thompson breaking. A raw, Guttural sob tore from his chest. "No, no, no, please," he whimpered, as the bailiffs moved in to handcuff him. He looked back at his father, his eyes wide with animal terror. "Dad, help me. Don't let them take me." But Robert Thompson didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the wood of the bench in front of him, as the bailiffs led his weeping son away. The victory he thought he'd bought had been a phantom. This was the reality. And it was a reality he could not control. There are no winners in a courtroom like this. There is only justice, and it is a heavy, somber thing. The day of the sentencing arrived, and the air in the courtroom felt different. It was charged with a finality that everyone could feel. This was the day the debt would be formally called in. Jake Thompson sat at the defense table, but he was a ghost of the boy who had laughed weeks before. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a standard-issue jail jumpsuit. His hands were cuffed in front of him. His eyes were red-rimmed, hollow, fixed on the table. The reality of his situation had sunk in, and it had carved all the arrogance out of him, leaving only a scared, empty shell. Robert Thompson was there, but he sat alone. No team of lawyers surrounded him. No confident smirk. He was just a man in a quiet, expensive suit, staring at his son's back as if from a great, unbridgeable distance. The judge, a woman who had seen every shade of human failing, spoke with a gravity that silenced the room. "Jacob Thompson," she began, "you have been found guilty of taking a life with a conscious and wanton disregard for its value. The law has a name for that. It is called murder." She detailed the sentence: 25 years to life in a state penitentiary. The number hung in the air, a cold, hard fact. It wasn't 18 months. It was a significant portion of the life he had thought was just beginning. But before the gavel fell, the judge did something important. She turned to David Campbell. "The court recognizes the profound loss in this case. Mr. Campbell, would you like to make a victim impact statement?" All eyes turned to David. He stood up slowly. He didn't look at Jake. He didn't look at the judge. He looked straight ahead, as if speaking to Lily herself. His voice was quiet, but it carried a profound strength. "Your Honor," he started, then paused. "For a long time, I was lost in the noise. The noise of the lawyers, the noise of the media, the noise of a system that felt like it was designed to forget my daughter." He took a slow breath. "But today, I'm not here to talk about the law. The law has seen a killer. I saw the boy who took my daughter's light from the world." He finally turned, and his gaze swept over the entire courtroom, not with anger, but with a heartbreaking clarity. "My job here was never to punish Jake Thompson. My job was to be Lily's father. To the very end. And a father's job is to protect his child, to speak for them when they cannot, to ensure that the world knows who they were and what was taken from them." He looked directly at Jake then, for the first time since he'd walked back into the courtroom with that envelope. There was no hatred in his eyes. There was only a vast, unyielding sorrow. "Lily Campbell was an artist," David said, his voice growing stronger. "She saw beauty in places other people missed. She could capture a person's soul with a pencil and a piece of paper. She had a laugh that could make a bad day good. She was my best friend. And she is gone." He let those simple, devastating truths settle in the silent room. "So you see, your sentence, while just, is not my concern. My concern was making sure that the truth of who she was, and what was taken from her, was the final word in this courtroom. Not a lie, not a paycheck, not a laugh, but the truth." He nodded to the judge. "Thank you." And he sat down. There was nothing more to say. The judge's gavel fell with a single, sharp crack. "This court is adjourned." As the bailiffs led a sobbing Jake away, he looked back at David one last time. There was no smirk, no laugh. Only the hollow, bottomless terror of a boy who finally, truly understood the weight of a human life. He had taken one, and in return, his own was being taken from him. David didn't watch him go. He had said what he came to say. He had done his job as a father. It was over. What do you do when the battle is over, but the war inside you still echoes? For David Campbell, there was no parade. No celebration. The cameras had found a new story, the town had moved on, and the world kept turning. But for David, the world had permanently tilted on its axis, and he had to learn how to walk on the slope. He found himself at the cemetery. It was a crisp, clear morning, the kind Lily would have loved to capture in a painting. He stood before her headstone, a simple, elegant piece of granite. He reached out and traced the letters of her name with his fingers, as if he could feel the echo of her spirit there. He'd brought her favorite flowers, sunflowers. He laid them gently against the stone. "It's done, Lily," he said softly, his voice carried away by the breeze. "It's finally over." He didn't tell her he'd won. He didn't tell her he'd gotten justice. Those words felt hollow here, in this place of pure loss. Instead, he told her that he'd spoken for her, that he'd made sure they all heard her name, saw her light, even if it was just for a moment in a cold courtroom. He had been her father, right to the very end. He thought about the portrait she'd drawn of him, the one from their last perfect day. It hung in his living room now, no longer a source of searing pain, but a reminder of the love that had been there. That would always be there. The love was what was real. The grief was just the price he paid for it. He turned and walked away from the grave. He didn't look back. He knew he would carry the weight of her absence every single day for the rest of his life. The sound of her laugh would never not be a memory. But the crushing, suffocating despair had been replaced by something else. A quiet, solid strength. The strength of a man who had stared into the deepest darkness the world could offer, and had not broken. He had bent, yes. He had been reshaped by the grief. But he had endured. He got into his car and drove away from the cemetery, the sun washing over the quiet streets of Oak Ridge. He wasn't okay. He would never be the man he was on that last perfect day. But he was still here. He was still Lily's father. And for now, in the silence, that was enough.